and then they're going to get this. Yep. Okay, guys, Mr. Ash here. Sorry for the delay with the technical difficulties. Apparently, we had to create a new link to be able to get this sucker working. When you find the stream on here, make sure you sign in, please. Text people, tell them I had to create a new link. Okay, I'm going to do that now. I am up on YouTube, and I had to have a new link created, period. Please tell people to look on YouTube for the new link, period. When you do get on, please sign in, give your name. For extra credit, I'm going to need you guys to ask a question if you want to get your extra credit. Again, I apologize for the technical difficulties. All right, I got 6 people here. Guys, if you could, type your name so I can see who's here. Remember, you have to ask a question to get extra credit. There we go. Okay, I apologize for the technical difficulties. Of course, the original link, something had to happen with it right as I was turning this thing on, ready to go. That's why it's nice to have a 15-year-old computer whiz in the house. All right, tonight we're going to talk about foreign policy, or if we're talking about our AP bagpipe chart, think about America in the world. Listen, peeps, the link in the classroom does not work. I had to create a brand new link. Okay, my son had to create a brand new link. If you could, text somebody that you know, tell them don't use the link in the classroom. If they go to my YouTube channel, just jump in just like you guys did, okay? Again, I apologize. We literally had to create a link. That's why I'm a little bit late starting here. So if you can text somebody in the classroom, let them know. Don't use Google Classroom for the link today. Just go over to YouTube. All right, today we're talking about foreign policy, or America in the world, when we talk about our bagpipe chart. Got a nice sunny day here, pretty chilly, but at least it's not raining. And when we talk about foreign policy, this really is one of those topics that I could see being on the AP test this year. You know, when I say being on, I mean the AP test, because we only have the one question. But foreign policy has been consistently one of those essay topics that does show up a lot. And it certainly lends itself for an essay prompt that's going to be, remember, periods 3 through 7. So it is something that sets up pretty well. It also lends itself very well to the idea of continuity and change over time, or, you know, the dreaded CCOT. And so we'll talk tonight about foreign policy. We'll also talk about what essay skills you need besides CCOT. And again, if you want extra credit for this sucker, I need you to send me a question about foreign policy. Anything from periods 3 through 7. All right. So when we talk about foreign policy, you'll see code words for it. I've had kids go, but Mr. Ash, you said this is a foreign policy essay. I don't see the words foreign policy. Guys, you got to think a little bit outside the box. If you see international relations, if you see foreign affairs, if you see on the world stage, those are all kind of code words for foreign policy. When we talk about foreign policy, remember, we're talking about wars, we're talking about treaties, we're talking about conflicts and disagreements between the United States and somebody else. So it's important to understand, that a lot of topics can happen here. When we do write about foreign policy, it can have implications on our economy. Our economy can drive it. And this does let you tap in, especially like presidential knowledge. All right. So I'll start talking. But again, if you want your extra credit, you have to type a question in. So when we start about foreign policy, we have to go back in time. And if you're writing a foreign policy essay, set up the idea that the first foreign policy was neutrality. In the 1790s, George Washington issued his proclamation of neutrality, saying that the United States would not pick a side between Britain and France. So let's start with that sucker. Why did G-Dubs have to do this? Well, he had to do it because of the French Revolution. You guys learned in Global and AP World that the American Revolution caused revolutions throughout the world. And in this case, Washington gets himself in a bit of a pickle because of relations with France. So if you remember, 1754, so we can really pull this sucker back. Great Britain and her colonies in America, they were at war with the French in the 7 Years' War, also called the French and Indian War. At the end of the war, Great Britain won. They gained control of most of North America, but they inherited a whole bunch of problems. They went heavily into debt. Not only were they in debt, but they had been fighting wars on and off in Europe. The 7 Years' War was just the last of them. So the British, one, were war weary. Two, they were broke. So what the British decided to do was they were going to move away from that policy of salutary neglect. Now, why do we care about that? Because all of a sudden now the British, they're going to enforce mercantilism. They're going to crack down on other types of colonial self-government. And what ends up happening is the British passed some unpopular laws, the Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, the Townshend Acts, to try to raise revenue through taxes to pay off their war debts. They also try to restrict the colonists' ability to move west of the Appalachian Mountains with the Proclamation of 1763. That leads to the American Revolution. Enter France. France, who's still pretty sore about losing to Britain, they decide, we're going to get back at Britain. We're going to help the British colonies in North America get their independence. Now, the French also had some ulterior motives, thinking, look, if we do this, we'll get some territorial concessions. We'll get something from this. So King Louis of France goes heavily into debt, something to the tune of like $31 million. And as a result of that, the French treasury is depleted. It helps cause the French Revolution. Now, one of the results of the French Revolution in 1789 is the French end up going to war with Great Britain. Now, during the American Revolution, if you remember, after the Battle of Saratoga, the French signed a treaty of alliance with the Americans, saying, that we would be a formal alliance, that the French would provide their navy, and we have a complete military alliance there. After the war, and now in the 1790s, when France has their war with England, they expect us to honor that treaty of alliance and join their side against the British. Well, what ends up happening is now Washington's put in a bind. And America was divided. His cabinet was divided. Washington, remember, was the president who created the cabinet because he wanted to have advisors. He had a lot of these precedents that we like to call the unwritten Constitution. Precedents, examples of things that are not actually written in the Constitution, but are a part of our government today. His Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, was pro-British. He pointed to our common language, our common history, our common trade relationship. His Secretary of State was George Washington, who was obsessed with all things French. Jefferson thought the French Revolution was just a natural continuation of the American Revolution. Jefferson even encouraged the French ambassador, a guy named Edmond Genet or Citizen Genet, to actively try to recruit Americans to help France against the British, recruit American captains, and Washington then responded with his proclamation of neutrality. Now, why could he do that? Well, he's got the Atlantic Ocean. Geography was a huge factor in the development of the United States. The fact that we had such a big ocean in between us. Now, this is the one time in Washington's presidency, he kind of takes a hit. It's just like the crack in Captain America's shield. Neutrality is an unpopular thing to do because it's hard to do. If you think about your friendships or your family relationships, when two people fight, it feels like they're trying to suck you in. In this case, the British get really aggressive. They block off American shipping to certain ports. You have Edmond Genet trying to recruit Americans to fight against the British. And Washington, to deal with the British, sends the Supreme Court Justice John Jay. Remember, John Jay is before John Marshall. He sends John Jay to England to negotiate a treaty, which we call, wait for it, Jay's Treaty. And the whole purpose of Jay's Treaty was to try to keep us neutral. Problem is, Jay doesn't have anything really to negotiate with. He has no leverage. So he does a good job for what he could do to keep us neutral. But in the end, it's kind of neutral in a pro-British type of lean. So what ends up happening is Jay's treaty, the news of it gets leaked by Thomas Jefferson because he's Secretary of State. He's got this info. Before Jay even comes back with the treaty, people are angry. John Jay said that there were so many people burning him in effigy, you could light the entire east coast of the United States. There was a saying, damn John Jay and damn anyone who won't damn him publicly. So neutrality, Washington kept us neutral, but even that kind of, hurt his popularity. In 1796, when Washington gave his farewell address to the American people, that was one of the big topics of his speech, that, America needed to stay neutral. Well, the whole idea of neutrality gets a lot harder. I mean, George Washington's got more cred than anybody. He can survive the criticism, and quite frankly, how many people really would dare to do it directly to Washington? The guys who come after him, not so much. John Adams is a one-term president after G-Dubs, and one of the reasons is his difficulties trying to keep us neutral. Again, guys, just a reminder, if you want your extra credit, I need to see a question about foreign policy from you. All right, so he needs to keep us neutral. Now you have John Adams, and let me let my dog in. Okay, my son got her. Loudest doorbell in America. So what ends up happening is Adams has to deal with the French now. He's got a bad relationship with the French going back to the time he was an ambassador, and he ends up trying to stave off what they now call the quasi-war. He tries to keep us out of war. Tensions are really high. You got people like Hamilton, who's now a retired citizen, supposedly, who are clamoring for war. Adams tried to send delegates to keep us neutral, but they were told they couldn't meet the French foreign minister unless they paid a bribe in what becomes known as the XYZ affair. Adams signs, and the Federalist-controlled Congress passes the Alien and Sedition Acts, partly to try to quiet down and censor Jefferson's Republican Party because they were criticizing him. And a lot of the members of his party were recent immigrants. Adams thought that the criticism was going to stoke up a war. Ultimately, that kind of dooms him. Now, Adams actually ends up negotiating a treaty to keep the peace with the French, but by the time he does, it's too late. He loses the election of 1800. Now enter Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson, who, it's kind of funny, when he was Secretary of State or Vice President, Jefferson believed in strict interpretation of the Constitution. We should be pro-French, limited government, states' rights. And when Jefferson becomes president, he does this big shift in many ways, including Jefferson adopts the policy of neutrality because now Napoleon is in charge. Now, Jefferson does stage a big foreign policy coup in the Louisiana Purchase. He purchases what becomes 15 states for $15 million. It's like 2-3 pennies an acre. And you can call that a foreign policy maneuver because it keeps Napoleon out of the West. Obviously, it has bigger implications. It leads to manifest destiny. It doubles the size of the U.S. But now Jefferson's got to deal with other issues. He's got pirates. Yeah, pirates called the Barbary Pirates, Rob. off the North African coast. Jefferson sends the Marines in there to deal with them. But his big headache comes from Napoleon. It comes from France. Jefferson tries like heck to be neutral, but the British were impressing American sailors. If you remember, they were stopping our ships, kidnapping our sailors. They were denying us the ability to trade in ports. The French were too. So Jefferson, in an effort to stay neutral and in an example of frustration, issues the Embargo Act of 1807, basically saying that's it, no more foreign trades allowed. And in doing so, Jefferson thinks he's going to punish Britain and France. In reality, he tanks the U.S. economy, and he especially hurts New England, home of those Federalists, because they rely so much upon trade. Jefferson leaves office. He's replaced by James Madison. Madison tries to keep us neutral. Congress passes what's called the Non-Intercourse Act, which says, look, we can trade with everybody except Britain and France. That doesn't work. There's a Makin's Bill number 2 is passed, which says, hey, Britain, France, whichever one of you guys recognizes our right to be neutral will trade with you, but not the other guy. That doesn't work. And now, Helena, you see neutrality kind of break down. In 1812, the United States Congress declared war with Britain in what we now call the War of 1812. And it was fought for a couple reasons. So now, let's take a pause for a second here. We said that like the baseline foreign policy of America, going back to the days of George Washington, was this idea of neutrality. So now if I'm writing a CCOT essay, and again, that's a historical thinking skill we have to have down. Now we have to say, okay, look, how did American foreign policy change over time and deviate away from it? But also, what caused that change to happen? Well, what caused Madison to get Congress? Remember, presidents don't declare war. To get Congress to declare war. For one thing, you have a group of young members of Congress who grew up in America as a separate independent country. They're ultra-nationalistic. We call them the war hawks. They're primarily from western states. Guys like Henry Clay of Kentucky. John Calhoun in South Carolina is a war hawk. They want war. They look up to Canada and go, oh boy, that'd be a lot of nice new states. You also have the British, this practice of impressment, kidnapping Americans, forcing them into the English Navy because they need sailors to fight against Napoleon. Ironically, the British Parliament made a decision. All right, look, we're going to stop impressment. It's not getting us anywhere. It's not actually helping us. It's causing problems. But by the time they did, it was too late to get word back. And so we fought the War of 1812 in many ways over an issue that had been decided. Okay, so the war itself, it ends in a tie. And the phrase we use for that is status quo antebellum, meaning whatever territory you had before the war, you get to keep. The war was settled by what's called the Treaty of Ghent, G-H-E-N-T. It's a place in Belgium. So basically the U.S., you had this territory before the war, you keep it. Britain, we're not redrawing any lines. But the war, even though it's a tie, does have some important meaning. One, it creates a ton of nationalism in the United States. We talked about that idea of nationalism the other day. Cultural nationalism, American artists, the Marshall Court, the dictionary. Diplomatic nationalism. After the War of 1812, you get the creation of the Monroe Doctrine, which we'll get to in a minute. Economic nationalism, Henry Clay's American system. It creates a war hero. The two most famous battles in the War of 1812. One is the Battle of Fort McHenry in Baltimore Harbor. That's where we get our Star-Spangled Banner. And the other is the Battle of New Orleans, where Andrew Jackson, Old Hickory, becomes a war hero. Ironically, that battle in New Orleans happens in January of 1815, about a month after the Treaty of Ghent was signed. But again, they can't tweet out, hey, there's no more war. So now after the War of 1812, the United States, again, we're more nationalistic, but we revert back to, in some way, shape, or form, that idea of neutrality, or at least something close to it. In 1823, we get the Monroe Doctrine. Now, you could say the Monroe Doctrine's isolation. You could say it's closer to neutrality. I like to say isolation, but either way, you get the idea that we're moving back towards that continuity again. Okay? So, what do we have here? Napoleon's gone. Those European nations, now they don't have to deal with short, crazy French guy. They want to try to take territories back. And Russia's been moving down the Pacific coast of the United States from Alaska. Britain says to the United States, hey, look, let's issue a joint statement telling the rest of Europe to stay out of Latin America. And Monroe almost does it. He's talked out of it by John Quincy Adams, his Secretary of State, the real author of the Monroe Doctrine, who says, don't you do that. If you make an agreement with the British, now you're giving them an excuse. The first time some Spanish ship so much as like does anything, the British will be coming in. We don't want them in. So the U.S. goes it alone. They issue the Monroe Doctrine and say, hey, Europe, stay out of the West. Don't interfere. Don't take back the territories you lost, and don't try to start new colonies. And there's not much a reaction to it. It doesn't really get tested. But the Monroe Doctrine is important because, and here's your little sexy essay point, although it represents kind of a continuity, we're staying with this idea of isolation and neutrality, in reality, what it does is it's going to set the stage in the late 1800s and early 1900s for imperialism. It's going to become one of the reasons why we can justify getting involved in the Spanish-American War in 1898. Cuba's in Latin America in the Western Hemisphere. It becomes the basis for the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The big stick, interventionism. It, during the Cold War, will become the basis for the United States getting involved in Cuba when the Soviet Union puts nuclear missiles there. Okay? And again, it represents us moving back towards this continuity of isolation and neutrality. And I don't know about where you guys are over there, but it's colder than heck here. I'm going inside. Honey, I froze to death. Can you get the Chromebook, the extra Chromebook that's outside? Okay. She's trying to stay away from the camera, guys. I could turn this Chromebook if you want, honey. Yeah. In the news today, history teacher gets beaten to death by his wife. All right, so here we'll go. Hi, James. James is half asleep. All right. Oh, it's so much warmer here. Okay. So now, say hi to James with his school uniform on.
Hi.
PJs. All right. Monroe Doctrine we talked about. Now, I don't need that one, though. Thanks. After the Monroe Doctrine, we get to manifest destiny. Zach asked, do we have to send 5 things we know, 5 things we don't? No. Here's the deal, guys. That is, because I know how nutty it's for you guys. I'm trying to be flexible. I would never do this in normal circumstances, but it's not normal circumstances. So what I'm going to do is, if you need to get the extra credit, if you can't be online for whatever reason, you can watch it after the fact, but you have to send me 5 things you know, 5 things you don't know. Tonight, to get the extra credit, I need to see you actively involved in the conversation. Okay? Manifest destiny. That could be your essay topic because it represents a lot of things. 1, it's a foreign policy. It's America in the world. 2, it deals with peopling and movement and my internal migration, which is one of the topics AP loves. It also deals with geographic interactions because we'll talk about natural resources and stuff like that. So if we're going to talk about manifest destiny, of course, if I say manifest destiny, you say, go west, young man, go west. We have to talk about the Louisiana Purchase by Thomas Jefferson. In 1803, Napoleon loses his crown jewel, his prize colony. He loses Haiti. So now he wants to sell the Louisiana Territory because to him it's worthless. He wanted to use Louisiana to try to feed his colony in Haiti. Now what ends up happening is instead, Jefferson at the same time sends a delegation, Robert Livingston, James Monroe, and says, I want you to try to buy the city of New Orleans. New Orleans controls your access to the Mississippi River. American farmers needed to access the Mississippi River because especially farmers in the Ohio River Valley, the roads aren't good enough. So they needed to have some type of way to be able to get their crops to market. Well, when the Spanish had Louisiana before the French, the Spanish would from time to time cut off access to the Louisiana Territory. So something has to be done. The American delegation meets up with the French foreign minister, and they're asked, hey, do you want to buy the whole Louisiana Territory? And the initial reaction for the Americans is, oh, no, we just want New Orleans. Wait, what we meant was, yeah. So they negotiate a price of $15 million. I mean, it's too good a deal to pass up, but it's going to cause a lot of problems for Jefferson. Remember, Jefferson, before he was president, was Mr. Strict Interpretation of the Constitution, meaning he believed the federal government could not do anything unless it was explicitly written out in the Constitution. That means Jefferson, to pull this off, he's got two options. One, he could ratify an amendment, which could take years, and by then, Napoleon's crazy, he could change his mind. Or two, he's going to have to channel his inner Alexander Hamilton and take a loose interpretation of the Constitution. So Jefferson does. And of course, the Federalists, they criticize him for it. The other thing that happens is that we don't have the money to pay for it. Jefferson's got to finance this through debt. Again, he's been possessed by the spirit of Alexander Hamilton. Now, Jefferson, the guy who always talked about democratic ideals, then decides, well, we need to have like a military government out there at first because, there's Native Americans, there's Frenchmen, there's people who are Spanish. We don't know, if we can really have them voting on their own territorial laws. Jefferson sends Lewis and Clark to go explore the Louisiana Territory. And the importance of that Louisiana Purchase is the idea that now all of a sudden we have all this open land, and the Louisiana Purchase starts the idea of manifest destiny. Now, I've got a bunch of people asking about synthesis for manifest destiny. And Faith, yeah, I would say you could consider it to be manifest destiny. I think, however, they frame the essay question is going to dictate to you what you do. But if you think about it, manifest destiny is going to lead to significant territorial acquisition. It's going to lead to the United States annexing territories that belong to other countries. It's going to lead to a war. It's going to have treaties up the yin-yang. So, yeah, it's definitely foreign policy. We'll get to some synthesis for that. There's a ton. I mean, honestly, if we had a manifest destiny DBQ in some way, shape, or form, I think you guys would be very, very happy. So, America's whole history, at least the early part of American history, is going westward. During colonial times, Americans were getting crowded. They started to move out west. After the 7 Years' War, they wanted to move west of the Appalachians. That's why when the Proclamation of 1763 was passed, it frustrated and angered so many Americans and helped cause the Revolution. Shortly after we were independent, even before the Constitution was written, I read a great book years back called A Grand Idea, where George Washington, in between being a general and then later becoming the father of our country, goes on this expedition to try to see if he can discover a western route to, dig a canal using the Potomac River. Americans cut through what's called the Cumberland Gap. It's a gap in the Appalachian Mountains. And that's where you get like the stories of the frontiersmen, and the idea of like the American pioneer in the log cabin. Well, with Manifest Destiny getting launched now with Louisiana, every time we expand west, it's going to lead to an important question, remember. Should slavery be allowed? And that's why Manifest Destiny is a powerful essay topic. Every time we acquire a territory, it brings up a new controversy. Should slavery be allowed in that territory? As a result of the Louisiana Purchase, in 1820, get the Missouri Compromise. Maine becomes a free state. Missouri's a slave state. They divide the rest of Louisiana at 3630. Well, we push further west. In 1836, Texas, which was one of the northern parts of Mexico, declares their independence. No, not because of the Alamo. Remember, they lost the Alamo. But they declare their independence, and they asked Andrew Jackson to annex them. Now, at the time, there was balance, free and slave, and Jackson was afraid. Now, think about this. If Andrew Jackson's afraid to add a territory because of the controversy over slavery, it might be a rough deal. Jackson passes on it. In 1844, James K. Polk gets elected. Polk makes a couple promises. One of them is, I'll annex Texas. Before he can do it, the outgoing president, John Tyler, did. So Texas comes in as a slave state. Polk comes into office, and again, he's really pro-Manifest Destiny. He wants to add territory. So what ends up happening is Polk tries to buy California from Mexico. Mexico says no. So now we end up with the Mexican War. Polk blockades the Rio Grande River. There had been a border dispute involving Texas and Mexico. Polk takes the side of Texas, and he orders General Zachary Taylor, remember that name, he'll become important, to blockade the Rio Grande River. In class, I did the whole, am I touching you? Does this bug you? Does this bug you? I'm not touching you. And that's kind of what he does. It leads to the war with Mexico and all the controversy there. And this is where you can get incredible synthesis for Manifest Destiny. We talked about the anti-war protests. Why? Because Northerners, especially members of the Whig Party, they realized this is just a war to try to spread slavery. It led to things like the Wilmot Proviso. David Wilmot was a Northern congressman from Pennsylvania. He tried to get an amendment put into a war spending bill saying that no slavery would be allowed in any territory we took from Mexico. It led to protests. Ralph Waldo Emerson, the famous transcendentalist, wrote the essay, and he gave that famous quote, "Mexico will poison us." You guys read a chapter in Battle Cry of Freedom from that. Use that, reference that book. It's cool, it's good. Well, just make sure, again, with everything that you do, you're writing your own stuff. No plagiarism, guys, because they will catch you. I feel bad for any kid who tries to pull a fast one. The most important thing is you guys cannot communicate with one another. I'd recommend leaving this in another room. Okay? So anyway, the war with Mexico leads to controversy. Henry David Thoreau spends a night in jail, ends up writing his essay on civil disobedience because he didn't want to pay his taxes because he knew that was going to support the Mexican War, a war for slavery. You can synthesize Thoreau to Martin Luther King, who read Thoreau and used civil disobedience. You could synthesize the protests of transcendentalists like Emerson and Thoreau to that song we played for the Vietnam War, Alice's Restaurant by Arlo Guthrie, which was a protest song about the draft. There's a young member of Congress who calls out Polk and issues what's called the spot resolution. I want you to take me to the spot where supposedly Mexico started this. That guy was Abraham Lincoln. So the other big thing is the Mexican War. Forget the war itself. The war ends up leading to the Civil War because it creates so many controversies, particularly with the question of slavery. And it leads to the Compromise of 1850 and the Fugitive Slave Act. So you could go back, walk it back, and say, hey, look, the Mexican War causes the Civil War, and explain why, and say, in a similar vein, other wars in American history have left negative results that have caused future conflicts. 7 Years' War to American Revolution, World War I, World War II. You could say, hey, look, it sparks a debate. It sparks an outrage. People who are against this idea of acquisition and connect it to the Spanish-American War. Remember, both of those wars start for questionable purposes. You got Polk with the claim that American blood spilled on American soil, when in reality he's starting the war. And the Spanish-American War was caused because we blamed Spain for the sinking of the Maine, when in reality, it was an accident. And both of those wars were fought because of territorial acquisition. Manifest Destiny, imperialism. Please, for the love of God, don't go say, and they were both fought with Spanish countries. I've actually had kids in my Regents classes do that. Please don't do that. All right. When we talk about Manifest Destiny, there's a lot of technology that you can bring into it. The telegraph, invented by Samuel Morse. The railroads. Clipper ships, better ships that allowed, people to leave from West Coast cities and go out to Asia, to China and Japan. The economic motive to try to trade in Japan. In the 1850s, Admiral Matthew Perry kind of kicks the door in on Japan. Philosophical stuff, beliefs, ideas, and culture. Manifest Destiny certainly is. This idea that America has this special place in the world, that it was our destiny to go from, quote, sea to shining sea. And again, tie it into the antebellum reform movements, the transcendentalists, the abolitionists. Manifest Destiny continues after the Mexican War. We go in other directions. We get the Ostend Manifesto. We try to buy Cuba from Spain. Almost happens. We make a little purchase called the Gadsden Purchase. I showed you a funny Jimmy Fallon video. You can YouTube that sucker up. It's a great, just funny video. And I think, in this situation, we all need some funny stuff. It's also going to lead to other consequences. It's going to lead more and more to Native Americans being pushed off their land and onto reservations. Cherokee Indians under Andrew Jackson were removed from Georgia, put into what was called Indian Territory in Oklahoma. And Native American groups were promised, that'll be your land as long as the grass is green and the water runs. Well, we move out west, they get pushed further out. The Mormons had actually gone all the way out to the Salt Lake in Utah, thinking they could create their own country to be left alone, and there's going to actually be conflicts between the U.S. government and the Mormons when we start to, settle the territory we took from Mexico. Manifest destiny, you can say, continues into imperialism. In 1867, you get Seward's Folly, the purchase of Alaska, Seward's Purchase, Seward's Icebox, whatever you want to call it. Now there's no more west to go to because we're on the Atlantic Ocean, but now we go up north to Alaska. I would certainly say you can very easily connect imperialism to manifest destiny. All right, so let me see here. I've got a couple questions here. I get quite a few, actually. KD wants to know how the U.S. economy influenced foreign policy. We'll do that in a second with imperialism. Garrett, what impact did the filibuster expeditions have on the topic of slavery? Okay. Garrett going for something very specific. So, Southerners became hell-bent prior to the Civil War on the idea that slavery had to spread no matter what. So now there's no more go west. Many Southerners went looking down south. Under the Pierce administration, the U.S. tried to buy Cuba. We almost had the deal done, but the press got a hold of it. It aroused a bunch of attention in the North. There were some people, like one was a guy named Walker, who actually led what were called filibustering expeditions, military operations to try to take over Latin American countries. This guy Walker went down into Central America, overthrew a government, took over a country, and the neighboring nations had to get in there and basically get rid of him. That's how hell-bent the South was on expanding slavery. And that's one of the reasons why they were so pro-manifest destiny, because they felt they had to expand slavery because as long as slavery grew, it would continue. So Faith asks, can manifest destiny be considered foreign policy? I think we covered that. Synthesis for foreign policies. Abby, we did a couple, but we're going to do a bunch more of those suckers. Katie, I'm not going to forget your question. Jenna, how did nationalism influence foreign policy? Jenna, I'm going to give that to you in a second. We do imperialism. Lauren, we talked about leaning against neutrality before it was broken. Lauren, we will get to that when we get to the two world wars. How did Cold War foreign policy, Lily, impact Americans at home? I'll try to get to that. Now, remember, that will not be on the AP test because the test stops at 1945. However, you can make some synthesis connections, so we will get to that. How did the Mexican War affect U.S. foreign policy? I think we hit the Mexican War well enough. Causes and effects of the War of 1812. Zach, we hit that. Garrett, wait a little bit as we start doing imperialism. Take your insular cases question, pop it back up there, okay? Helena, same thing when we get towards World War II. Oh, I see you're typing for Gianna. The influence of communism, wait till we get towards the end of World War II. Because that is good synthesis. Again, it's outside the time period, but we can use that for something. All right, manifest destiny continues. After the Civil War, during and after the Civil War, the U.S. tries to settle the Great Plains, close out the frontier. There's a combination of government policies and technology. One, better railroads. Two, inventions like the steel windmill, which allow you to take advantage of the one natural resource you have a ton of on the plains, wind, to pump water from the really deep wells. This guy, Joseph Glidden, invents barbed wire, which allows you to fence in cattle. John Deere invents the steel plow, which is lighter, doesn't get stuck, it's more durable, and the soil in the Midwest is incredibly compacted. If you can get through it, it's the most fertile soil around. So you have technology. You also have some government policies. During the Civil War, since the South was no longer in the Union, they couldn't vote against a lot of policies in Congress. So 1862, the Republicans passed the Homestead Act, which says, look, you get 160 acres of free land. All you have to do is farm it or build a house on it within 5 years. That's something that the Republicans in the North wanted. The Transcontinental Railroad was passed. 1869, the Pacific Railway Act, and they built the first transcontinental railroad through the North. Now, eventually, there'll be 4 different transcontinental railroads built, and it's the presence of these railroads that allows people to move out west, goods to be shipped back and forth, especially for farmers. And really, it's the railroads that kind of bring our country together. If anything, it's the railroads that kind of close out the frontier. There's other government policies. The Morrill Land Grant Act, which creates colleges out in the Midwest to teach agriculture and mechanics. The Dawes Severalty Act. I talk about Indian policy. The United States government engages in a policy of trying to remove, put on reservations, or in some cases eradicate Native Americans. And the Dawes Act was actually passed as a result of a book by a woman named Helen Hunt Jackson called The Century of Dishonor. The intent of it was to kind of like was pushed by humanitarians. The idea of assimilating Native Americans, abolishing the tribal system, getting rid of reservations, and trying to like incorporate people in. The act itself instead made things worse. By abolishing the tribal system and getting rid of reservations, you made it so that Native Americans couldn't have good land. You know, if you're trying to destroy someone's culture, that's not helping them. The Dawes Act, in an effort to assimilate, actually made conditions worse. The U.S. government, in the meanwhile, would break treaties. They would commit some atrocities like the Sand Creek Massacre or the Massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890. The U.S. government hired people, paid people to bring in buffalo pelts. Kill the buffalo. We don't care what you do with the meat, just bring in the pelt. For every pelt you bring in, you get paid. Why? Kill the buffalo, you take away the natural resource for Plains Indians like the Lakota Sioux. And the railroads, to entertain their passengers, would actually do that. They would stop the train, hand you a rifle, and say, hey, how many can you hit? You know, it's your fun activity. Now, in the late 1800s, now you have imperialism. Again, connect imperialism back to the Monroe Doctrine. Okay? The Monroe Doctrine passed in 1823, said Europe, don't interfere in the Western Hemisphere. And now here we are saying we are going to interfere in the Western Hemisphere and the rest of the world. Again, look at what we've got here. Continuities and change. We start off with, I'll go left to right on your screen, neutrality. All of a sudden, we're neutral, War of 1812. It's our quick little blip. Now we're back to neutrality. Manifest destiny. When James K. Polk goes to the war with Mexico, that's the exact opposite of neutrality. Now we're getting involved. Imperialism. We've really moved away because now we're getting involved further and further away. Latin America, but even in China, in the Philippines. Okay? So always think about the changes. Now, why does this change happen? Why do we get imperialism? Because it's during period 6. It's during the Gilded Age. 1865, period 6 ends in 1898. You run the Gilded Age to 1900. But either way, it's the age of big business. We need new markets to sell our goods. You don't want to have overproduction. You want to be making more than you can sell. We need more raw materials. And the Gilded Age is the era where big business drives everything. So why wouldn't it drive foreign policy? Why wouldn't it cause wars? So what do we get out of this? Purchase of Alaska. In 1898, in the 1890s, Americans overthrow the Queen of Hawaii, Liliuokalani. It takes a few years, but finally in 1898, President William McKinley annexed Hawaii, added in as a U.S. territory. But the big event in 1898, remember, was the Spanish-American War. Cuba had been a Spanish colony. Pardon me for 1 second. Can't talk that long without drinking. So, strong iced tea. Yeah. Didn't put up water in that thing. So, Cuba's a Spanish colony. They're rebelling, trying to overthrow Spain. They want their independence. The Spanish are committing atrocities. The military commander in charge of putting down the Cuban Revolution is this guy, Weyler, whose nickname is the Butcher. They use concentration camps. Now, one, you got interference with the Monroe Doctrine. You got a European nation getting involved in the Western Hemisphere. 2, stories of the atrocities the Spanish commit come out. And these stories especially are highlighted, exaggerated by the yellow journalists. William Randolph Hearst, Joseph Pulitzer are just 2 of them. Those newspaper publishers who exaggerate stories because they can sell and get their bottom line. A couple other things happen. The Spanish ambassador, Delome, writes this letter just insulting the United States, insulting McKinley, and that Delome letter fires up a group of people in America that we call jingoists. Now, Jenna, this is your nationalism question. Okay? Nationalism has been an element in influencing foreign policy. Nationalism gets us involved partially in the War of 1812 because you have the war hawks, the young members of Congress who were born in America and who, want an excuse to go to war with Britain. Nationalism increased after the War of 1812 because we've had 2 wars now. We're 1 win and 1 tie, but we're undefeated against the British. War typically creates more nationalism. In this case, you got people led by Theodore Roosevelt, jingoists, who view war as a way to glorify your nation. Jingoism is like nationalism and militarism had a baby. So now McKinley's getting pressure from the jingoists. Ironically, the one guy who's not pushing for war is McKinley. He's the last American president to have fought in the Civil War. And it's amazing how when we've had presidents over the years who are military guys, they tend to be the one who keep us out of wars. They must know something. So we have American business interests in Cuba, especially sugar companies. They are threatened by all this conflict going on. So McKinley says, look, we got to send a message. Hey, Spain, watch it. Don't go messing with our businesses. Let's flex a little bit. And we send this brand new battleship, the USS Maine, down to Cuba. The Maine explodes. The U.S. Navy does a half-hiney kind of investigation. They conclude the explosion came from below water level outside the ship, which the yellow journalists interpret as, it was a bomb. To hell with Spain, remember the Maine. That was a newspaper quote. It was a famous chant. So now McKinley, he's not stopping this train. He goes to Congress. Congress declares war. The war itself, not that big a deal. More Americans die because of mosquitoes and food poisoning. Yes, that's one of the things that Upton Sinclair wrote about in The Jungle. Look at the connections you're making. Guys, when it comes to your information, your outside information, and even your document information, remember, this is a skill test this year. Make a gosh darn connection. If you use outside information, follow it up, make a connection. With your documents, if you can compare and say, hey, look, documents 1 and 2, they both share the same point of view. Or if you can contrast 2 documents, that's what they want you to do, okay? So anyway, in your documents, when you're sourcing them, when you're looking at purpose, okay, is this Teddy Roosevelt trying to get us into war? Is this a yellow journalist exaggerating a story about Maine so that he can make more money? Is this perspective point of view of an imperialist, of an anti-imperialist, and explain why that matters? Well, this guy's an imperialist, so clearly he's biased and he's viewing Spanish actions this way compared to other time periods. So more Americans die because of skeeters and bad food than they do from Spanish bullets. You get Teddy Roosevelt becoming the war hero, commander of the Rough Riders. Before Roosevelt becomes a Rough Rider, he quits his job as Secretary of the Navy. Not after he sends the U.S. Navy to the Philippines to take the Philippines from Spain, even though he technically didn't have the authority to do that. Roosevelt becomes a war hero. It launched his political career, governor of New York, vice president, El Presidente. Results of the war. We get it's like instant oatmeal of empires. We take Puerto Rico. We take the Philippines. We actually pay Spain for the Philippines. Guam. Cuba cannot become a U.S. colony. At the beginning of the war, there was this add-on to a war spending bill called the Teller Amendment, which said Cuba could not become a U.S. territory. So a few years after the war, I don't know if you guys remember, but in class, I did the thing with somebody's arms. Hello, puppet. Cuba becomes our puppet with the Platt Amendment. Cuba could not enter foreign policy agreements without our permission, so we could keep their independence. Cuba couldn't go into debt without our permission, so we could keep their independence. Cuba, you're gonna sign this lease for Guantanamo Bay. Hey, thanks a lot, Cuba. Sure glad you're independent. It also leads to a lot of social unrest in America. An organization's formed called the Anti-Imperialist League. Some prominent members are Mark Twain, William Jennings Bryan. Andrew Carnegie is an anti-imperialist. So again, now you can connect that to people who are against the Mexican War, like Lincoln, Thoreau, and Emerson. Connect it to Alice's Restaurant during the Vietnam conflict. You can always connect foreign policy, guys. It's also going to lead to other efforts at imperialism. Teddy Roosevelt becomes president after McKinley because McKinley's assassinated. Roosevelt's the one who negotiates the construction of the Panama Canal Zone. He purchases that zone from Panama, who was not even a country, Roosevelt helped make Panama independent by encouraging a revolution. And again, we're intervening in Latin America. Roosevelt issued the Roosevelt Corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, or what we call big stick diplomacy. He was the guy who doubled the size of the U.S. Navy. And one of the reasons he wanted that canal was that he could quickly move his fleet from the Atlantic to the Pacific back and forth if he needed to. And the Roosevelt Corollary is this idea that we will intervene in Latin American affairs. Guys, again, take the pause button on your essay and go, holy cow, we've gone so far away from the idea of neutrality. We're making a foreign policy statement saying it's our right to interfere in other countries. It's our right to sail what was called the Great White Fleet and flex on other countries. Roosevelt, there's a movie character from the 80s called Dirty Harry. Roosevelt's Dirty Harry going, go ahead, make my day. All right. After Roosevelt, we still stay involved. You have William Howard Taft. We call it dollar diplomacy. Good old Tubby Taft. Remember that? Tubby Taft uses dollar diplomacy. We're going to get countries to do what we want by investing lots of money there, by having U.S. business interests influence them. Woodrow Wilson comes in. Woodrow Wilson is a moralist. I actually talked to this AP teacher a long time ago. The guy was really bright. And he said, look, the way you remember it is Teddy was a pragmatist. Like, practical, be a little ruthless. If you got to make an omelet, you break some eggs. It's okay. Big stick. Hey, I'll motivate you. Taft was the legalist. Remember, Taft wanted to be a Supreme Court justice. So Taft looked for, what are ways that we can, within law, force or persuade people to do things? Dollar diplomacy. Wilson's a moralist. He's the son of a preacher man. So he feels like if there's a moral reason that compels it, we're going to get involved. There's an incident with Mexico when Wilson's president, and of course the big one, World War I. All right, Hannah, who else or what other groups would have supported Jeannette Rankin and her stance in neutrality? All right, so Jeannette Rankin, for those of you who don't recall, she was the first woman elected to Congress during World War I. Well, on April 2nd, 1917, Woodrow Wilson went to Congress and said the world must be made safe for democracy. There were like 50 people in Congress who voted no. Jeannette Rankin was one of them. It's courageous for doing that. Agree with it or not, she was in a small group of people who voted against the war. Too, she's a woman doing it. When Pearl Harbor was attacked and FDR went to Congress on December 8th, 1941, Jeannette Rankin was the only person who voted against getting involved in World War I. Now, Hannah asked what other groups would have supported Jeannette Rankin and her stance in neutrality. There were, I can't give you specific groups, Hannah, other than there were so many people who, at the onset of World War I, still thought we should remain neutral. A mistake kids make is kids think that, the Lusitania sank and that's it. We got involved in World War I. The truth is, the Lusitania went down in 1915. We didn't get involved in World War I for another 2 years. And especially after the war, people were convinced, we were right. We shouldn't have gotten involved in that. In 1940, a group was formed called America First. Their most famous member was a guy named Charles Lindbergh. And they were, let's stay out of the war. All right, back to World War I. So now, look how you can come full circle. George Washington creates this idea of neutrality in the 1790s. He has difficulty with it. Adams and Jefferson, when they come after him, they have difficulty maintaining neutrality. We end up getting out of neutrality with the War of 1812. Madison went to Congress because the British were taking away our freedom of the seas. I'll say that again. The British were taking away our freedom of the seas. They were impressing American sailors. Now go 100 years fast forward, America's neutral. In fact, when Woodrow Wilson ran for re-election in 1916, his campaign slogan was, he kept us out of war. Well, the Germans are taking away our freedom of the seas now. Unrestricted submarine warfare with those U-boats. They sink ships like the Lusitania in 1915. They sink the Sussex, the Arabic, other ships. They are taking away our right to be neutral and, more importantly, our ability to travel the oceans to trade. So there's another synthesis connection, guys. There's that piece of analysis. You're taking two time periods and bringing them together. Both those were caused at least from the United States perspective, because our freedom of the seas was being taken away. Now, again, war brings change, and World War I's a great example. We didn't do much at all for the war itself. We said, hey, trench warfare, okay, good, move on. But we talked a lot about the impact of World War I on the home front, the Selective Service Act, the draft, the Espionage and Sedition Acts to make it illegal to criticize or interfere with the war effort, the Supreme Court case of Schenck versus the U.S. And if I say Schenck versus the U.S., you say clear and present danger. The boom it had on the U.S. economy, how it led to the great migration of African Americans moving up in the cities to work in wartime factories, xenophobia, fear of foreigners, anti-German prejudice. I gave you the dorky examples of hamburgers became Liberty steaks. Sauerkraut was Liberty cabbage. You got Liberty measles, okay? And by the way, good example to watch out for xenophobia. Be on the watch. Be careful. You're going to, we've seen little bits of this, but people becoming xenophobic to people from Asia, because of COVID-19. It's amazing when we get stressful situations, how we see these recurring themes. German xenophobia during World War I, Japanese internment in World War II. You hear about stuff that's xenophobic and hateful towards people of Asian ancestry now with COVID-19. It's sad. Sometimes history does repeat itself. All right. Here's what we care about the most for World War I. Again, we were neutral at the start. Now we have to get involved. At the end of the war, Woodrow Wilson tries to take this leadership position in the world. He wants what he calls peace without victory. And this is where he announces his 14 points. I want to create a League of Nations, most importantly. Freedom of the seas, no secret alliances, a reduction in military so that we don't have future wars. And Wilson's whole idea was if you do these 14 points, you will make World War I, quote, the war to end all wars. Well, he doesn't get everything he wants because the European allies, they want retribution. You guys learned about the war guilt clause and reparations last year. Wilson gets his baby, though. He gets the League of Nations. But in America, we have this system of checks and balances. And I think we're going to do an entire lecture just on checks and balances. We have to. It's a great way to cover everything in the class. So now what ends up happening is Wilson brings the Treaty of Versailles back to the U.S. Senate. And a couple things happen. For one thing, 1918 is an election year. Wilson gives a speech and he says, the only truly patriotic thing to do right now is vote Democrat. Guess who controls the Senate? The Democrats. Wilson brings this big group over to negotiate the Treaty of Versailles. He brings a Republican. Woodrow Wilson's maybe the smartest president ever. The guy was the president of Princeton University, but here he makes some questionable decisions. Now, there's even the dorky story how Henry Cabot Lodge, who was the leader of the Senate Foreign Services Committee, says, Mr. President, can I carry the treaty? And Wilson's response was, not on your life, Senator. There were two groups of people who were opposed to the Treaty of Versailles. You had the reservationists, guys like Lodge, who were like, look, Mr. President, I think we can work with this, but there's certain parts of this treaty that, we think we need to compromise on a little bit. Two, you had the irreconcilables, people who are head dug in, oh, heck no, we're not supporting this. Woodrow Wilson, who's usually the smartest guy in the room, digs his heels in and becomes incredibly stubborn. He refuses to negotiate on the treaty. He goes around the country on this tour by train, giving speeches, working really hard, nonstop tour, saying, look, I'm going to rally the American people to stand up for the Treaty of Versailles. He gets a stroke. And Wilson is incapacitated, and really the treaty dies with Wilson's health situation. In 1920, the treaty fails for good. The U.S. never joins the League of Nations. We never ratify the Treaty of Versailles. We cut a separate side deal with Germany to get out of the war. And that's where we start in America. Isolation. In the 1920s, we try like heck to not be involved in foreign affairs. So much so that it rubs off on our immigration policy. Again, that idea of xenophobia. And we'll do an entire night on immigration, talk about the Emergency Quota Act, the National Origins Act, the KKK, and the first Red Scare in 1919. But America becomes determined we are not going to get sucked into another war. In 1921, President Harding hosts what's called the Washington Naval Conference. where we set ratios. There's a whole bunch of treaties that say, okay, look, for every 5 battleships that Britain and the United States have, this country gets 3, this country gets 1.67, and Japan signs off on this treaty. Oh, okay, fine. We'll take less battleships. But there's loopholes in the Washington Naval Conference. It doesn't restrict smaller ships. There's no provision yet for a technology that hasn't been used yet. Aircraft carriers. Plus, Japan gets a concession from the United States and Britain. The U.S. and Britain agree, okay, Japan, in exchange for you kind of limiting your battleships, we promise we will not build up our defenses in the Near East, in places like the Philippines, which is exactly what Japan wants. In 1928, when Calvin Coolidge is president, you get the Kellogg-Briand Pact. A whole bunch of nations get together. I think it's like 62 countries, and they outlaw war as a foreign policy tool. Great. How do you enforce that? See, what the League of Nations going to do? Not much. What country never joined it? Now, ironically, think about this. The idea of the League of Nations was an alliance. The idea of strength in numbers. If one member of the League got attacked, the others would defend it. We don't join the League. The U.S. Senate never ratifies the Treaty of Versailles because we have the George Washington neutrality mindset. No foreign alliances. They'll get us involved in future wars. All right, Jordan and Jake, I see you've got questions here about the League and about the United Nations. Give me some time. I'm going to set that up, okay? Anna, I will get to some songs and books that you can connect to foreign policy. Those are great questions. All right, so now dig this. I'm going to take care of the League and United Nations thing. Again, George Washington. Are we a continuity with him in neutrality? Are we deviating and going into this idea of getting involved in the world? So at the end of World War I, the pro-neutrality, the isolationist people, they win. We don't join the League. But because we don't join the League, it sets up World War II. At the end of World War II, at the San Francisco Conference, the United Nations was created. FDR's baby. Something that he had sketched out with the other members of the Big Three, Stalin and Churchill, at earlier conferences. And now here's FDR getting a United Nations created. By the way, the first UN ambassador was the widow of FDR, Eleanor Roosevelt. Now, in the United Nations, in a post-World War II world, the UN has a Security Council. And there are 5 nations who are permanent members on the Security Council: the US, the Soviet Union, China, Great Britain, France. If the UN Security Council wants to, they can send troops. In 1950, when North Korea attacked South Korea, the U.S. goes to the UN, and the UN sent forces against North Korea. So now we've really, in many ways, kind of put to bed this George Washington idea of neutrality. If you think about it, one of the big impacts of World War II, at the close of Period 7, at the close of, for all intents and purposes, our course for this year, that whole George Washington idea of neutrality, it's done. In fact, we really haven't been neutral since. We have been involved in world affairs. Even if we pull back a little bit, we have military bases all throughout the world. After World War II, during the Cold War, so somebody asked a Cold War question, and we are the ones who create NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. George Washington must have been rolling over in his grave. What's the whole big idea of NATO during the Cold War? If any member of NATO is attacked, the other members will jump in. It's the exact opposite of Washington and neutrality. All right, interwar years. So as the Axis powers build up, the United States still does nothing. In 1934, the U.S. Senate has a committee, and they conclude that we were sucked into World War I by bankers and businessmen, that Wilson provoked it. So in 1935 and 36 and 37, Congress passed the Neutrality Acts, which were designed to keep us out of world wars. They said stuff like, Americans could not travel on ships owned by countries at war. Americans could not sell weapons to countries at war. Americans could not give out loans or credit to countries at war. In other words, Americans are not going to be allowed to do any of the stuff that got us involved in World War I. In 1938, the U.S. supports the Munich Pact, the appeasement of Hitler when he annexes Austria. But the big thing you see is this idea of continuity and change. In the 1930s, you do see change. At the beginning of the decade, we're hardcore isolationists. Hell no, Treaty of Versailles. But as time goes on, we modify that position of neutrality. In 1940, FDR gave that famous Four Freedoms speech that everyone in the world has the right to freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, freedom from fear. He's kind of given a moral purpose to the idea of we might have to get involved. In 1939, Congress passed a new Neutrality Act, which created this idea of a cash and carry basis that we could sell weapons to the Allies, but it had to be no credit and they had to come get it. The big one, 1941, the Lend-Lease Act. We send billions of dollars in aid to the Allies, even the Soviet Union. And I gave you the line. FDR gave the speech. He gave the garden hose analogy. If your neighbor's house is on fire, you should lend him your garden hose because that fire might spread, burn down your house. In fact, during World War II, we really take a leadership role. Remember, the big three, FDR, Churchill, Stalin. Later on, take out FDR, put in Harry Truman. At the end of World War II, we have assumed this leadership position. Why? Well, our bombs are bigger than your bombs. You know, the use of atomic weapons changes the role of the United States. What's the Cold War? The Cold War is the United States and its allies trying to stop the spread of communism. You know, it's the United States. It's with the Truman Doctrine in Greece and Turkey, $400 million in aid. It's $12 billion in aid with the Marshall Plan, the Berlin Airlift. So think about how we've made that change over time. All right, looking to clean up questions here. Jake and Jordan, I hope I answered your question in a satisfactory way. Garrett, if you're still here, I know you asked me about the insular cases. The insular cases are a nice little essay detail for imperialism, because here's a question. When you do take territory and you plunk a flag in some rock somewhere, whether it's Puerto Rico in the Caribbean or in the Philippines, now the question's going to arise. Do people who live in American territories have the same constitutional rights as people in America? And in the insular cases, this group of cases, the Supreme Court said, nah, you don't get guaranteed full constitutional rights. You get whatever Congress gives you. Let's see here. Jordan, I took care of Jake. Anna, songs, books, we could connect to foreign policy. Yes. All right, for one thing, if you're talking about the Spanish-American War, Alfred Thayer Mahan, The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. We called that the imperialist playbook. Teddy Roosevelt read it, took a whole bunch of notes on it. Mahan's thesis was that the great nations of the world, to be powerful, had to have naval bases. And it became a reason why you'd have imperialism. World War I played you a song called Over There. Johnny, get your gun, get your gun. Then I played you the Metallica version from one. You know, the idea, over there, we're going to be patriotic. Johnny, get your gun. That's how we went into the war. And after the war, not so much. You could reference Upton Sinclair with the Spanish-American War, because when he talks about the gross meat and stuff like that, he references the fact that a lot of people died from the Spanish-American War with food poisoning. Marissa, I hope I answered your question in the way that you wanted. Helena, if I didn't, let me know. Alex, would America's actions toward Native Americans affect other countries' policies with America? All right, Alex, I'm going to do a separate deal with Native Americans. Here's the one thing I would say. If you're doing a foreign policy thing, I don't think you would want to include Native Americans in there. It's a semantics thing. I would be careful with that one, Alex. Let's see here. Give me a second as I scroll up. Filibusters, U.S. economy. Did certain political parties believe in certain foreign policies? Bennett, that's a great question. Go back to the Mexican War. The Democrats were the strongest party in the South. Polk, he's a Democrat. Polk called himself Young Hickory. He patterned himself after Andrew Jackson. The Whigs were kind of in. In fact, Manifest Destiny, the Mexican War actually killed the Whig Party, because the Southern Whigs were like, yeah, let's expand. The Northern Whigs are kind of like, The Republicans, created in 1854, were created as a result of expansionism, and they were really made out of what were called conscience Whigs and barn burner Democrats. and free soilers. Remember the Free Soil Party, who were against expansion because they looked at it as what you're really doing is trying to expand slavery. Okay, we've done an hour tonight, and I'm going to just take a quick drink here. If you've got a question I didn't answer or I didn't answer it well enough, get something in the comments there. There's no such thing as a bad question. You guys are awesome as always. Miss being with you. But tell me if you have any other questions that you need answered, guys. It doesn't have to just be foreign policy. Gonna wait for about one more minute. James, say hi. Hi. Wave, James. Yeah, James starting to get used to pajamas for his school day. I don't know if that's a good thing. All right, it doesn't look like we have any more questions. I hope this was helpful. If it was, let me know. If you have specific topics you guys want, let me know, guys. I'm here for you. I'll do whatever you want. Until then, log off and plug in your Chromies, homies.